policy, such as competition, such as free choice, leading to the best solutions. Neoliberalism is the root cause of environmental damage and war. Therefore, you need to solve neoliberalism. Ways to answer this. You want to defend marketplaces. This is a critique I think you can impact turn. You can challenge whether or not neoliberal education is the root cause of their impacts, because they're probably going to skip over from, well, you embrace neoliberalism in education to all neoliberalism is bad. But they probably don't have an internal link between those two things. And last, you can defend neoliberalism. You can defend marketplaces in education as being good and productive. You can also just defend the theory itself. Next critique is deschooling. You probably have felt this way at one point in time or another, but education is dehumanizing. What we place an emphasis on in education is grades and getting a diploma. We don't emphasize our representations with other people. We don't emphasize our relationships with other people. Education focuses on turning citizens into productive members of society. But what productive means is where the critique comes in. Usually, it means you can go and get a job. So I caught the tail end of the Honors College presentation, and they were saying that 97% of people will be employed after they go to MSU. That's the way in which education tells you you're productive. We do it at our school too. We tell parents, you send your kid to our school, they will have a job. They'll be productive members of society. They'll be good people that go to work at 9 a.m. in the morning and come home at 5 p.m. and produce something while they're on the job. It eliminates difference in creative thought. Arguably, the current system of education is too test-oriented and not educated enough at the grassroots. I went to China and taught teachers how to teach debate in China. And what's interesting is that they recognize that debate caused bottom-up creative thinking. And that bottom-up creative thinking is what's critical in order to make society creative, to adapt to problems, etc. The alternative is schooling that focuses on education that emphasizes relationships, connectedness with other people. Not an outcome, but how connected we are to others. Deschooling critique answers. People that are educated will have hope for the future. We need bright minds in our current education system in order to provide the best outcomes. The utopian alternative will fail. Illich is not very good about saying what we do after we deschool. He's good at saying schools are bad. And so you may want to identify that your alternative will fail and we need to be pragmatic. And government and corporate elites make deschooling impossible. The government controls the schools. Corporations control things like charter schools. They have an incentive to make these things happen. Therefore, it is difficult to challenge that system unless you work within the system. And so your education reforms that you present are the best way to work within the system to challenge it. Number 3, Freire, the banking model of education. The current model of education emphasizes teacher knowledge over student knowledge. So the teacher is like a bank. They know a lot of things and they provide that information to you. You withdraw from the bank and you gain education. It doesn't emphasize that education is a two-way street. I learn from you all. So as an example, my friend back here earlier talked about the Iraq War as an example of representations creating reality. I did not think of that example. I did not come in here with it. Now I have a new example that I can use to explain to people in the future why that's true. I learned from the relationship with you all as opposed to just being a bank that provides you information. Students receive knowledge from the bank the teacher has, and that causes students to be dehumanized and controlled. The teacher has an agenda, they provide that agenda, you're educated into that agenda. How many classes have you had that taught that the United States was bad? The United States shouldn't have been involved in various things. A couple people have. Most of the room probably has not. You've probably not been educated to believe that the United States is an evil imperialist monster trying to take over the world. That kind of education is not embraced by current society. Modern curriculum emphasizes the interactive model. So a lot of people understand that Freire is right. My wife is an educator. She teaches middle school. She has a master's degree from the University of Michigan. I know that might make her unpopular here. But it's a top 5 education school in the United States. And she says the teachers already know this. And they emphasize it in their curriculum. The permutation solves best. There's an excellent article I read that said parts of the banking model are true and parts of the interactive model are true. And a good teacher will emphasize both of those in the relationship with their students. And the alternative fails and is likely to be a banking model. What are you going to teach people? Well, if you teach them a certain thing, that means you were a bank that provided them information. If you say educating them in a particular skill is necessary to solve the banking model, then you're using the banking model to try and break down the banking model. Sheet number 4, biopower. Schools surveil you like a prison. You're going to love school by the time I'm done. School. Poor and minority students are educated in the lens of criminality and exclusion. Probably not a huge surprise to you, but discipline problems in schools are most likely targeted at minorities. Minorities are more likely to be considered discipline problems, are more likely to be subject to more surveillance than white students. And there are people who believe that the primary reason we have schools is to keep kids under control. To surveil them with the cameras we have at school, to make sure that they're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing. And defined as shouldn't be doing by those in charge of the school. Biopower leads to genocide. There's a very famous card from Foucault which argues that our ability to surveil society allows us to control life itself and lead to extinction. Now I will say that I think they're going to have difficulty tying their general biopower impact from an education link, which is something I want you to challenge when you debate this. You can defend surveillance in education. So yes, surveillance in education is used to control, but it's also used to empower. So they have found when they put more cameras in schools that they can spy on victims of sexual assault. And as a result of that, they can intervene and stop those kinds of things from happening. Second, challenge the link to privacy violations. You're at school, but you don't have the privacy violations in your everyday life, which is sort of my argument that biopower may not have an internal link to the impact. And challenge the impact to privacy and biopower. There are certainly people that say the right to privacy is overstated. On the surveillance topic, people ran the feminism critique that privacy was used to dominate women. It was an excuse to say we shouldn't interfere in the home. And the home became a place where men were the master, and what they did in the home was problematic. You can also defend biopower on the grounds of just impact turning that and saying it's good. Number 5 is critique of technology. Technology is increasingly used in education. In fact, it's difficult to imagine education without it. When we say a school is underdeveloped or doesn't have many resources, primarily what we're talking about is technology. Technological focus hurts the environment, and technological mindset leads to war. We teach students to interact with technology. We teach students to rely upon technology, and soon technology becomes their master. You can point to the benefits of technology in education to answer this. You can defend how technology is critical to various values like the economy. You can defend technology in general. This is another critique that I would not be afraid of the impact terms. I'm using technology now to teach you. I think it's easier to teach you with technology, which is the reason why I'm using it. Therefore, maybe the problems of technology are overstated. Number 6, Gramsci's critique of hegemony. Gramsci was an Italian theorist. He wrote his notes from jail. He argued that the ruling class needed ideology to sustain their power. So he was a Marxist, but he was a Marxist that also thought ideology was important. In other words, you need to embed in people the current system and the way of thinking. And the way you do that is to educate people in the current culture. People who critique education now argue that it's too focused on white Americans. It's too focused on the founding fathers, not the founding mothers. It's too focused on the problems. It ignores the problems that the founding fathers had, like Jefferson was a slave owner who owned over 100 slaves. We don't tell those stories in school because we have an ideology that we want people to grow up in. And then hegemony leads to domination and war. I should point out that this is not necessarily the hegemony of the Brooks, Eikenberry, and Wolfert variety. This is not one nation controlling other nations or being the dominant power. This is that an ideology, especially the American ideology, and you impose it into people and lead to domination and war. After all, American ideology hasn't been the best for other people. Answering it, number 1, I read a really good article that Gramsci's critique is specific to post-war Italy. He may have been right in the 1930s with regard to how to challenge the Italian state, but he's not right now, especially in developed economies. Number 2, Gramsci de-emphasizes class. So he gets in trouble with his friends, the Marxists, because he doesn't emphasize class enough. Gramsci says you need a combination of class power and ideology to control society, whereas the Marxists say it's all about class. And number 3, he's inconsistent for that exact reason. Sometimes he emphasizes class, sometimes he emphasizes ideology. It's difficult to come up with a coherent theory from Gramsci. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you about something that isn't about education, but is something you will definitely hear on the topic, which is the critique of disembodied politics run in the NDT finals of 2017. It was not called a critique, it was called a framework argument. But I still believe it is fundamentally a critique at its core, and therefore we will answer it as such. So, the affirmative should have a means to adopt their policy. It's not enough to just fiat at a distance your policy. You have to have a way to enact it. How are you going to cause this policy to happen? What's your means? The policy should be embodied. If it's not embodied, number 1, it misleads people. You don't have an intention to actually do the policy. You're just trying to trick people. Therefore, you're going to get people on board who don't want to be on board. Number 2, doubling. You can't separate the political from the personal. That's especially true of certain minority groups that are judged by the color of their skin. And they can't separate their ideas from the notion that they're inherently going to be judged by the color of their skin. Number 3, it hurts marginalized voices because your focus on institutions will marginalize those groups who are not in control of those institutions. And as you probably know, we largely, our institutions are controlled by white men. Therefore, if you go through institutions, you would marginalize those voices. Answering this critique? Oh, put critique again, so I'm going to have to do this on the fly. Number one, you want to defend that debate causes social change. The notion of arguing from a distance of something creates social change. So how do people become aware of problems in the world? Maybe the problems aren't in their own backyard, but they become aware of those problems in the world from the distance. So, I became aware of gender oppression by running an affirmative that was about South Asian gender discrimination. The topic was development assistance in South Asia. And I learned a lot about gender oppression, which I then applied to my everyday life. I became more aware of that problem. Number two, you have to learn about problems that aren't on your doorstep. Just because something isn't within your immediate sphere of reference doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn about it. So a friend of mine named Leslie Wexler learned about the problem of landmines in Cambodia by running that affirmative, and then she became an activist on that cause, giving money to that cause. We learn about problems that aren't on our doorstep when we say we don't have to have a means to an end. Third, institutions are necessary to break down institutions. If we don't focus on institutions because we're concerned about marginalized voices, then we'll never learn how to change those institutions for the better. So we need an institutional purpose. Okay, don't take any notes on this screen because I accidentally put in the critique of disembodied politics twice. Now we're going to talk about critical acts. Why would you want to run a critical act? You're interested in critiques. Policy debate does not necessarily appeal to everyone. You might like to talk about critiques, and therefore you want to run them. You don't want to debate the politics dissent? So you might be from a small school and think you don't have the resources to keep up on the politics dissent, so you want to run a critical act. You can limit the opponent's arguments. Lots of times, people's strategy against critical acts consists of two arguments, a framework and a Marxist mechanic. And that's it. You're going to hear that every freaking round. I've been down wikis of teams that are critical teams and seen what teams ran against them. 80, 90% of the time, it's just framework and a Marxist mechanic. If you get good at answering those arguments, you'll be in good shape. And arguably it makes debate more real world. If you believe in Rutgers critique and that we shouldn't be challenging ideas that we are not embodied in our own politics, then you want to talk about things that affect you in the real world. Okay, two types of critique acts. The first is a topical path with a plan that claims discursive or philosophical advantages. Arguably, the trans app that you have in the packet is a topical critique app if you stop at the discrimination advantage. Number two, a not topical app that critiques the idea that the app should have to defend the resolution in the first place. Sometimes these have an advocacy statement, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're entirely planless. You need to figure out what they're saying by listening to the 8 minutes of the 1AC. Okay. Why would you want to run a topical K app instead of a non-topical K app? For one thing, it helps you against T or framework, because you can argue that you have a topical plan. Maybe our advantages don't all stem from enacting the plan, but they extend from discussing the plan, representing the plan, etc. Number two, it allows you to play both sides of the fence. You can defend the affirmative in policy land and in critique land and wait until the 2AR to make a choice. And it forces the neg to initiate all kinds of arguments you can make irrelevant. I think the trick to these AFs is the 2AR picks. The 2AR picks, am I going to defend this in a policy fiated world, or am I going to defend this as a representation, as a discursive argument? And the 2AR should definitely pick in those situations. How you defend your plan can be tricky. So you have a topical plan, but what does that mean? Are you defending the plan in a fiated world, or are you defending it as a rhetorical artifact? Are you defending it as a rhetorical criticism? Are you defending it as something that we should get together and advocate? Are you demanding that the federal government does something? You have a topical plan, but how you defend it can be tricky. So, looking at other camps, I've noticed that one topical camp, which might be popular, is teaching culturally relevant education for Native peoples. You can claim Native American culture as an advantage, and the plan can be defended at the fiat level or even at the debate level. I would also argue that the trans AF that you are running is a topical KAF, at least at the level of if you can just claim the discrimination advantage. Now we go to the non-topical KAF. Why might you run that? It increases your options. You can do more things with a not topical KAF. It limits the neg options because if you are not defending something that's related to the resolution, it's difficult for the negative to figure out what you are defending and therefore research it to come up with answers. It allows you to practice your arguments more. So if all of your debates are about T and the Marxism decay, you probably get very good at answering T and the Marxism decay. An example of a non-topical KAF would be an anti-blackness AF, that we should challenge anti-blackness in society before education policy. So, arguably, the reason why Chris Randall disagrees with me on this question, I'm not necessarily saying this is true, I'm saying you can argue for this, that segregation in society is what causes our segregation in the school systems now. And you can't look at education in a vacuum, you have to look at it in the context of larger society. So if we didn't challenge anti-blackness in society, we would be not being effective educators. Discussions of education can't be separated from our everyday lives. Answering KAFs, your baseline should be, the first question across that should be why vote affirmative. Try and ferret out what it is they want the judge to vote. What is the role of the ballot? Always challenge their role of the ballot. I've sat here in this room while Hakeem Muhammad, who was a very successful debater for West Georgia, who frequently ran not topical chaos, said, always come up with a role of the ballot that is radically tilted in your favor. Therefore, if you don't challenge the role of the ballot, you're playing on their turf. Try to find something to impact turn. Sometimes it's difficult because these teams don't defend a lot, but if they defend an answer to neoliberalism, if they're a challenge to neoliberalism, if they're a challenge to capitalism, if they're a challenge to technology, you may be able to run that those things are good and impact turn the economy. The hard line against the KAF is framework. You can call it T or framework. There's a mild distinction between the two, which I can get into if you really want to go down the rabbit hole. You have to defend the topic. The U.S. federal government is the federal government in Washington, D.C., resolved as a policy statement. You could also defend T-light or germaneness, that you have to have at least something to do with education in order for us to be prepared. You can kind of run these together. Your early position can be a hard line on you have to defend the topic, and then later on you can say this affirmative doesn't even have anything to do with education policy. How can we be prepared? You can defend it via topic-specific education. Why should teams have to defend the topic? I'll give you a few reasons. The first is in-depth debate on the topic. If you wanted to have a debate on your topic, both sides should be equally prepared. So if we come to the argumentative table unprepared to be negative, unprepared to challenge your affirmative, then we won't have an in-depth debate. We'll have a very one-sided debate. To borrow from my friend's Iraq example earlier today, Congress got a one-sided debate on the question of the Iraq War. So did the American people. We were told by secret intelligence from the Bush administration that they had weapons of mass destruction. So we got a one-sided debate. That one-sided debate caused us to reach the wrong conclusions. Role-playing, you need to role-play the government in order to learn how to challenge the government, learn what its excuses are, learn what its weaknesses are, etc. Switch side debate, you should be forced to defend things that you don't agree with because it will make you a better advocate for that cause. You will know what the answers to your position are and how to answer their answers. And the sirens call. We might be buying into something that isn't entirely true, and we need to test it. So we need to test ideas. The job of the negative is to test ideas. The negative is unprepared. We cannot adequately test ideas. That's the purpose of being negative. Then you can do the soft one. You can play by their rules. Word picks. If they argue that discourse shapes reality, then every word they use in the 1AC is potential ground for you. Now, I'm not usually a big fan of word picks, but if they're going to say that discourse shapes reality, if they're going to say that representations are all that matter, then their negative representations are something that you can use against them. So use the 1AC as a target. If they said social death, critique that. If they said human, you can run anthropocentrism against them. Take them further left. If they defend the government, say the government's bad. If they defend human rights, say that's not giving rights to non-human animals. Whatever you come up with, you can play by their rules. We have a file that's filled with our anti-critique arguments, that's filled with various critiques of certain words. If they use a certain word in 1AC, we can critique that. One of my favorites is history, because it should be called herstory. Conclusion. Critiques are powerful weapons. Use them to your advantage. I'm not someone that's going to sit here and say you should only do policy debate. I think you should do both. I think you should do both policy debate and critiques. History has shown, or herstory has shown, that critiques can be a very powerful weapon. You should use them to your advantage. And you need to know how to defend against them. Because even if you live in policy world and never like to read Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, Chomsky, you will have opponents that do. And so you had better be ready to defend against them. Even if you don't like them, they're not going anywhere. They've been around since 1991, and this topic may very well be the topic of the critique. You understand whether or not you want to run a critical laugh. Okay, I held you 10 minutes late, so you can go ahead and go to lunch or if you have any questions.